Hello, this is the CUDAN OLS seminar on March 30, 2026. And today it's our greatest pleasure to have Axel Bax and David Mimno, who will talk about extracting character movements with large language models.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. So what we're excited about is both expanding the range of things that we can do for humanities research, but also thinking about where we can push out the boundary of things that we can do with large language models. And what we've identified is what we hope is a annotation task that is sort of at the sweet spot between hard enough to be interesting and easy enough to be tractable. And what we hit on is extracting character movements with language models. Next slide. So what we're interested in is doing things at very large scale, at sort of fine-grained level. We're thinking we're not quite there yet, but we want to be operating at the level of tens of thousands of novels. In large format, long narrative text. So the thing we're specifically looking for is what we call mappable movements. It's sort of where your feet are in one place and then they're in another place. So kind of movement in two-dimensional space. So we're not thinking about sort of rows from the chair or turned around or raising your arm. We're thinking about sort of moving from one place to another. There's a special case of climbing a ladder, and we decided that was part of our set. That's the one case where we're sort of not moving in two-dimensional spaces there. Okay. So why would we do this? So one big question about literature is how is it sort of physically grounded? So when you're writing a novel, when you're writing fiction, you're creating an imaginary world that exists only in your head. And you want to translate that to the reader. And one theory is that there's sort of this axis between sort of more sort of dreamlike, dialogue-heavy internal narrative. Henry James is someone who in English often comes up as kind of this axis to something that's more physically grounded, where you get the sense that the author has kind of either literally or figuratively mapped out where the characters are going to be. And examples might be like Tolkien, where there's evidence that he kind of had an idea of where the hobbits were relative to Sauron at different times in the work, or something like Ulysses, where people physically, there's a day every year where people physically walk around Dublin and retrace the steps of Leopold Bloom. And one thing that's important to notice is like Tolkien is operating in a completely fictional world, whereas James Joyce is operating in sort of real Dublin as of 1920 or something. So one question that we have is how much of fictionality is coming from this. So why are we doing this? We want to see where novels lie on this scale. We can sort of imagine endpoints, but are they actually different? Like, is there actually a lot of movement in Henry James? If we take 10 to 70,000 other novels that we have access to, can we put them on that axis? We really want to know something about fictional spaces and fictional events in real settings. So we want to think about how space is used, and doing this sort of annotation of movement is an important step towards that. Third, we might learn something about how stories work. How do we create a fictional world? How do we populate it? How do we make it real enough for readers? And finally, we're just interested technically in can we automate the mapping of character movements in long form fiction? So this is traditionally, and I'm saying traditionally for like the last 5 years, language models have given us a lot of information about fairly short passages. We've started to get the ability to work more with like full novels with long context models. And we want to know how well we can map both the specific thing, but also do it in larger works at large scale. Next. So This is something that we feel like we've got new technology now with language models, but it's not a question that we couldn't have approached in the past. So we wanted to start by talking about what we could have done previously and why it might not have been good enough. So there's a lot of ways to track physical grounding. So just the idea of whether a novel sort of feels real and present or not. So one thing would be to look for named entities. You could get a gazetteer, you could look for London or Fleet Street or whatever. This could include geopolitical entities like North America or something more generic like the countryside. So there's a range of different lexical items that can indicate place that are more or less specific. Another thing that we've done in a previous study that was published at CHR last year is the presence of a map in a particular published work. So we did some work with computer vision to look at scans of, in that case, out of copyright works from HathiTrust, and just detected whether there's a map in that work. There's also a question of like, what does the map imply? Is it sort of so you can understand the physical movements, or maybe so that you don't have to understand the physical movements, but relying on the map to convey that? There's also simpler things like geospatial prepositions near the lake. There's this famous LitLab pamphlet that was suggesting that the Gothic style in 18th century English is characterized specifically by certain types of prepositions. So that's, again, something that you can recognize at scale, but not necessarily something that tells you all that much by itself. There's other ways of doing things lexically, like looking at cartographic terminology, like latitude, north, altitude, something like that. There's physical language about how a character is moving, like arms, hands, step, go, something like that, drive, maybe in later text. And finally, a last area that we've looked at in the lab is embodied language. So things about senses, interoception, ideas of smell, taste, so forth. So things that make a character's experience sort of real in the moment. Next. So what our task is we want to, we're going to use language models because it's 2026 and that's what people do. They give us a lot more ability to both recognize things that are complicated and also to produce output that is quite detailed. So the rough outline of what we're trying to annotate for our task is we want definitely four things. So the character who is doing the movement, where they're going to, so some sort of reference to the place where they're starting from, so the endpoints of the movement, and the rough scale of the movement. And we're dividing this into small scale, medium scale, and large scale. I'll describe those in greater detail in a moment. There's some other information that we often get, but we don't necessarily have, and it's not sort of one of the big four. So the distance moved, that's not always mentioned. Sometimes they say like, that they marked out 15 steps to find the treasure. That's pretty rare. It's more often that you sort of get a sense of distance in various units. I remember hearing an archaeologist who had worked in Turkey describing someone had given distance in terms of you walk 2 cigarettes. So there's lots of ways to describe distance in movement. The mode of transportation, this is often sometimes mentioned, sometimes not. As to the extent that we're able to look at works from the 20th century, we'd be interested in do cars or airplanes become more frequent? Looking over the 19th century, we might look at trains, bicycles. But again, we can think about these things and give examples, but knowing at scale, at fine grain is kind of where we're going. The type of movement, by this we mean, some movement is just like the character moved from here to there, but we also want to think about edge cases like they thought about going somewhere, or they decided not to go somewhere. So we have these categories for hypotheticals, negative hypotheticals, and sort of um, uh, metaphorical uses of movement that might we might want to annotate them so that we don't list them as physical movement, but we want to identify them. And finally, when the movement occurred. So next one. So why are we thinking of movement in terms of small, medium, and large? Well, that's coming from our previous work in maps. And what we noticed is that there's really sort of three scales of maps. And we think that that might correspond to the scale of movement in discussions of narrative. So the smallest scale is usually looking inside buildings. Axel sort of noticed that like the meaning of a line is really important in a map. So here, lines are often representing walls. You can sort of see the position of rooms. This is kind of on the scale of someone walking from one part of a house to another, or one part of an estate to another. At the medium scale, lines are often represent roads. Roads have sort of width. And here you might be talking about walking from one part of a town to another. You usually can't see inside buildings, but buildings might exist. And it's sort of at the level of how far you might walk in your, I guess the term is the 15-minute city now. Okay. And then at the large scale, you're getting sort of regions, continents. This is an example that's sort of a fictionalized version of Southern England, the Wessex novels. This turns out to be one of the most frequent maps that we see in our public domain corpus. Here, lines usually indicate sort of land-water boundaries, so rivers, coastlines. There's sometimes roads or railroads at this time period. Cities are more sort of dots or sort of a little blob, but you can't see into them. Okay, so I think this is where I turn over to Axel, who will tell you how this actually worked.
Thanks, David. So one of the interesting and challenging parts of this task is that movements are kind of complicated. They're not a lexically simple concept. They are relational between multiple entities. And as such, your kind of traditional just bag of words method may not be the most effective. So to kind of walk us through an example, I have this quote, which is pulled from like the 5th or 6th paragraph of Jane Eyre. My breakfast room adjoined the drawing room. I slipped in there. And so this is kind of what an ideal detailed annotation would look like for this sentence. So interestingly, we get the destination first and not the origin. These often come in different orders. So we have the breakfast room, then we have the drawing room, which is where she started. We have the character. In this case, that's just denoted by I. I'll get into that in a second. We have our mode of transportation, which is on foot. I slipped in there. And then that verb slipped in is also, our signal that there is a movement verb occurring. We know that from that verb, someone is going somewhere. We can infer the scale. They're going from one room to another in a house. So this is going to be a small scale movement, but we don't really know what the discrete distance is. And that's okay. That's, a nice to have, but not a need to have for our purposes. One of the things that makes this interesting, at this point in the novel, Jane's name has been mentioned once by some dialogue. The only way that we know I is referring to Jane Eyre is really by looking at the title of the novel, or by reading like 2 paragraphs further along when her full name gets mentioned. So a lot of the parts of this, sometimes it's the character's name, but sometimes it is the room that they're in or the place that they're going, are going to be context dependent and require additional context either before or after the actual string that contained the movement. So the current workflow that we have We have a set of human annotators. These are some undergrads that are a part of our lab that have been trained for months now at doing this annotation task. And so far, we have 16 excerpts from novels with varying types of movements in them. And in total, from those 16 excerpts, we have about 600 movements. We are hoping to get to a total of 32 or 40 total excerpts by the time we're done. We have a couple more weeks of annotation left. But we found from working with these annotators that it's a lot easier of a task if we really split it into two parts. So task one, which is the thing we've spent the most time on so far, is, taking a big chunk of text and then identifying the actual string that contains the movement within that chunk of text. From there, we can do task two, which is those annotations that I just covered. So the way that we're doing this kind of large scale, we're getting all of these ground truth annotations for task one from our annotators. We're going to start running some models to figure out which are best at task one. And while that's happening, we'll be training our annotators to do that secondary annotation task on those initial annotations that they gathered. So to kind of walk through what this would look like, we have a code book for them. We also have this flowchart that we made that makes it a little bit easier sometimes to walk through what the process looks like. The first thing you want to look for is usually a verb that suggests that movement is occurring. In rare cases, sometimes there is no verb. Sometimes it's talking about someone's arrival or someone's departure. So if you have a noun that, strongly necessitates movement, that is okay. Then obviously we want to check if character is actually going from one place to another. Sometimes the destination or the origin is implied. A good example, if we think about that Jane Eyre quote, maybe she said in an earlier sentence that she's in the drawing room, and then we get to the movement where she says that she went to the kitchen. We know from context that she's leaving the drawing room, even though it's not necessarily in that string. And then we also are not as interested in sort of recurring movements as much as we are interested in discrete movements. A good example of this is I used to go for a swim every day. And this is kind of a past recurring movement and not really a discrete movement in the kind of diegesis of the story. So we're not as interested in those. And then we also want to make sure that the character's entire body is moving. Kind of like David gave the examples earlier on, we're not as interested in someone turning in place or moving a body part. We really want to see that their feet are moving from one place to another. So the prompt that we've been using for Gemini, just for initial troubleshooting and testing, we're going to try some other models as well, both local models and flagship models. But the prompt that's worked the best so far with Gemini is giving it the exact same code book as our undergrad annotators, giving a text version of the flowchart, so just an if-then statement structure, and then some very basic information about the outputting format that we want it to return to us. And the output will just look something like this. We will give it an excerpt, a chunk of text, and it'll return a list of all the movements that occur in that chunk of text. The prompt for task two, again, we have done some initial work with this, but we're kind of waiting to do more detailed work later once we have our human annotations. But we'll give it a prompt, and then we will just ask for a JSON of all of those different features. When we give the models these prompts, we're going to be giving them the exact string with the movement, but also a little bit of context about a paragraph before and after the movement so that it can find out some of that extra information, like who the characters are, where they currently are residing. And then the response will just be some sort of JSON-like structure. And so with a little bit of testing, we found, like our human annotators, it is easier for Gemini to break these into two tasks. If we evaluate Gemini just on task one, and we only ask it to do task one, it does very well. If we have it do both tasks and we evaluate how well it's doing on task one, it does not do as well. Another challenge with this project is we want to work up to being able to do like 100,000 novels, which is many, many tokens. And we also have quite a few output tokens with that whole annotated JSON structure. So there's different things we need to do in order to make sure that all of this is running efficiently. We've already talked a bit about context, which is important. And so we're in the process of kind of optimizing and refining these two tasks. We have some ideas for this. We haven't really gotten to the point where we need to be testing which of these has worked yet, but we've considered playing around with the LLM generating kind of like a little scratch pad where it can, note who the major characters are, where they're currently located, and refer to this periodically throughout the text and update it periodically to kind of simplify that process of identifying context. The chunk size also varies quite a bit. A lot of the models nowadays have large enough context windows that we could put an entire novel in there. Some of our prior work suggests, as a lab, suggests that maybe after I think it was like 30,000 or 60,000 tokens, attention really kind of drops off and the task does not perform as well. So playing with chunk size. And then we've also considered queuing it into some of these named entities that we've already run for this corpus. And so looking into some of the kind of very, very initial results, all the stuff for task two still needs to be refined, but one of the things we found is of these different movement types, literal movements are by far the most common. So this is, he left for the store, very literal things. Alternatively, we have hypothetical movements. I must go to Shrewsbury. I should go to Shrewsbury are movements that have not yet occurred. Same thing for negative hypotheticals. Those just have a negation in front of it. I must not go to Shrewsbury. We have figurative movements. My mind was racing is one that could be flagged as a movement, but like it's not really about an actual movement. And then we also have implied movements. We added these because there were cases of stopping that were really interesting to us. So he stopped at the door. That meant that someone must have been moving and they arrived at the door in order to be able to stop at the door. We've also found that many of these movements are smaller in scale, and this is really interesting to us. Many of the maps that we found in our map image project, most maps occur at a large scale, but maybe most movements in novels are happening at a small scale. This is really interesting. It will be interesting to figure out how this actually correlates with the scale of the maps for those novels that contain maps. Not something that we've done just yet. And then we also have, so the initial corpus we've tested on is about 60 relatively famous novels written in English. And then these are the top 10 and bottom 10 of that set. And this is the number of movements normalized by the number of tokens in that novel. With the British Legion is the highest and is kind of our like test novel that started a lot of this and that we actually train our annotators on. It's kind of your like sort of teenage protagonist British adventure novel and characters traveling all over the world. And then we have things that do not have a lot of movement, like The Fall of the House of Usher, which is also really, really interesting. And one of the things that is especially interesting is how this varies over the course of the novel. So we have our top two with the British Legion and then the Metamorphosis, and then our bottom two, Scarlet Letter and the Fall of the House of Usher, as well as the mean for all 60 of these novels. And I have a few things I'll quickly point out because I'm sure you're seeing these spikes and want to know what's happening in the novel. For With the British Legion, that kind of first spike we have is the travel from his home in, I believe it's in Cardiff, and then traveling to San Sebastian. About a third of the way through the novel is roughly when the actual battling begins, and so there's a lot of movements kind of describing movements over the battlefield. And then about two-thirds of the way through the novel, there's a discussion between the main character with another character about all the places that he has traveled to, which is interesting. It kind of looks back on the rest of the novel. With the metamorphosis, we have kind of that initial trying to get out of bed. This is where the main character's been transformed into the bug. Another spike in movement when they're trying to navigate their new body and get out of the room. And then about two-thirds of the way through the novel, we see a bunch of movements of other characters being described. And then from the fall of the House of Usher, not much movements occurring, but we get this weird spike in the middle. And this is actually a bunch of movements being flagged from a character singing a ballad. It talks a lot about movement, the wind flowing through the trees, and other kind of metaphorical but movement described in that ballad. I believe it's back to you, David.
Great. So, we're in the early phases of this, although we've put a lot of work into it. So we're looking to build out this in greater detail. But I think already the results that Axel was pointing to show that, yeah, that this axis really does exist between sort of more narrative, sort of internal and interpersonal work, like Pride and Prejudice also showed up on that sort of lower end, and the more kind of I almost think it was like twitchy, and the British Legion, it's an author named G.A. Henty, who we'd never heard of, but was apparently very popular in the late 19th, early 20th century, sort of adventure stories for young lads. But it popped up because it had the most maps of any author. So that kind of clued us in that there was something going on here. So we're interested in this both from the perspective of thinking about novels and narrative, but also thinking about what can we learn about using these new language model technologies to get us something that is kind of difficult to annotate at the lexical level, but not necessarily super involved. And we've identified some clear things like annotation actually matters a lot, and human work in defining what it is that we're actually asking for. So yeah, it's not really as simple as just giving a novel and a prompt and getting exactly what you want. You have to figure out what is it that you're really looking for. And it was really, it was working in collaboration with the undergrads that we came up with that flow chart. That was not just us kind of dictating things to them. They're really part of this process. We also get a lot of challenges in terms of scale, cost, efficiency. I think one of the things that we're really interested in is to what extent can we break up the task into things that we can, where do we need the big fancy models that we have to pay for through APIs, and where can we do things kind of on the laptop scale with Olama? So could we use a smaller, maybe fine-tuned model in terms of doing the translation of a small chunk of text that we've already identified into a JSON output that breaks out the individual bits. But also, we see this as part of a larger project where we want to be doing things at the scale of tens of thousands of novels. We've got some other work called a City of Millions, where we extracted character networks from, I think, 70,000 Gutenberg volumes. This was before Gemini ratcheted down their free tier LLM access. And in that case, we were able to identify, so who are the characters, what are their relationships, and do they like each other, and what is sort of the characteristic of that relationship. And one thing that we found there, which kind of maps to what we found here, is when we were asking for kind of we asked for both a very fine-grained level of like, is this like a father-son relationship versus a more coarse-grained, like, is this familial? And what we found, at least for the models that were active there, was even though the fine-grained were sort of a pure subset of the more abstract relationships, the models were better at the fine-grained relationships than at the broader categories. So we ended up just asking or only looking at the fine-grained things and then sort of mechanistically inferring the medium scale. So next one. So where do we see this in the broadest picture? I was sort of gesturing to this. We're kind of thinking about our project and the project of digital humanities and cultural analytics at this point as trying to push out this boundary. I would describe like traditional close reading as sort of asking very specific questions about very small passages of text, and that's still a very interesting thing. Where people sometimes get in trouble is if they're making very broad generalizations from their 5 favorite novels. Those results may be interesting and fun to read about, but don't necessarily represent the full variability of work. On the other hand, what we've spent a lot of work doing for the last 20 years or so is kind of on the other side of the axis where we're really looking at very lexical, kind of shallow things, maybe at large scale, maybe with a lot of information that we're piecing together statistically. But we were able to scale up the volume of material we were able to look at, but we weren't really able to ask complicated questions. So what we'd like to do with the new technology we have is push out that frontier and think more about, are there broader, more interesting questions like how do authors create fictional worlds that we can answer at scale, at the sort of tens of thousands of volumes, hundreds of years. Ideally, we haven't talked about this axis, but many languages, so that we can do more comparative work and get hopefully more interesting, but also well-grounded results in ways that we wouldn't have been able to do before. So the takeaways, we are seeming to be able to track character movement at scale. LLMs can do this at this point, but it's not necessarily straightforward and it's not necessarily cheap. So we would like to push the methodology and also the efficiency. And finally, the results are not always intuitive. Axel, do you want to mention the example about Frankenstein?
Yeah, and there's some others that are surprising as well. I think like Moby Dick. But Frankenstein is interesting. You think of this as being a rather movement-heavy novel. There are a number of different settings. There's the Arctic. There's Frankenstein's house and laboratory, and then there's the kind of traveling through the countryside for the creature to catch up to Frankenstein. And yet this wasn't flagged as one of our novels containing a lot of movements, and that's because relative to the entire length of the story, the movements aren't taking up a lot of that story. Another one I think that is kind of surprising is Moby Dick. Moby Dick we think of as being a very highly mobile novel, but it is also a very, very long novel. And as such, not that many of the actual words are dedicated to movement relative to the whole novel.
So in terms of distance travel, they're going from like New England to the South Pacific, but at any given moment, they're sort of on a very small ship, not really moving around a whole lot. So
That's all we got.
yeah, that we sometimes get things that are kind of surprising, and that's why we measure things because it gives us a different perspective than what we would normally get.
Cool. Is that the last slide or?
Yeah, I actually can't remember.
Yep.
Is that the?
I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah,
Okay.
we have a
Yep.
few
Okay.
other slides
Nice.
if relevant questions come up.
We like putting the things that we want you to remember on the last slide rather than
Nice.
just
Yeah, thank you very
a
much.
query if anyone has questions.
This was super inspiring. And I say this as an art historian who usually needs images. And so there's a sort of, yeah, so there's questions from the audience. So there's Mike has a hand up. I think there is sort of three things which are sort of like I didn't sort of like think about. One is this whole axis notion is interesting, right? So this is just one of the possible axes that you construct here, which is an interesting one. The second thing is, obviously, as a visual person, I must ask the question you probably get asked all the time, which we should discuss a little later, is like, can you draw a map? And number three is of what? Like what kind of space are we actually talking about? And there's different ways of understanding space. But I think I should actually give the word to Mike to add his 50 cent too.
Oh, okay, thank you. There's lots of interesting stuff over there, and can you hear me well?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Basically, well, I have sort of. Luckily, we have a lot of time, and I have several sort of layers of questions, and one of them is related to sort of a question of coarse graining, if you will, because as far as I understood, you only look at the movement which is essentially happens on a scale of a single sentence, whereas, and that is probably partly explains your result that there are almost exclusively short scale movements, because whenever somebody moves to I don't know, to another side of the country, then it quite often will take, well, much more space than a single sentence. And I mean, in limiting cases like Lord of the Rings, which you I think mentioned in the beginning, essentially the whole novel is just one large scale movement. So I wanted to ask how you basically think about it, and do you think that it is possible to sort of introduce some sort of nested hierarchy of movement of different scales on different lengths in the text?
Yeah, I can answer this one. I love this question. It's something I've been thinking about too. You can almost imagine three types of movements that might occur. One is the kind that we're going after, which are these very short, discrete movements. There's the kind that you describe, which in order to differentiate, I like to refer to them as journeys rather than movements, because they're long, they take up usually multiple pages or even chapters, or with a story like the Odyssey, it is the entire story. And then you can also imagine a type of movement which is an implicit scene change between chapters. One chapter ends in one place, the next one begins in a new place, but they don't actually say it's in a new place. You just kind of gradually realize that as you read. All of these are interesting, and all of them are things that I would like to be able to track at some point. But those longer journeys are just that they are so much longer that they kind of have to be thought about differently. And I imagine that I'm going to have to create an entirely different workflow to be able to track those compared to these small movements. So it's something I think is interesting. It's not something that I think we're going to track with this project, but hopefully in a future one. But I think you make a great point, and this is part of what we wanted to draw people's attention to at this project. a lot of prior work that uses kind of character location coreferences tracks those large movements, of which there are a few. And we want to suggest that, yeah, there are long journeys that are broken up into a bunch of smaller pieces, just as there's a bunch of random small movements. And people maybe haven't been as clued into these small movements, which is why we're trying to kind of capture them and bring that to people's attention. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I find the same question of these longer journeys to be interesting as well.
And there's also a question of what's the best way to kind of computationally represent that? Like in the same way that maybe the character relationships, we wanted to start from the very fine grains, like what is the specific relationship these people have, and then take a more simple approach to building them up. Like, you know, I think of like the Mysteries of Udolpho. Like it takes 100 pages to go from like southern France to northern Italy. Each one of those is sort of like one day's ride in the carriage or going over a mountain or something. And it might be easier to get the fine-grained and then have some secondary, or in this case, tertiary process that would put those together. We've also got a project ongoing to look at how people summarize novels versus how LLMs summarize, and mapping specifically, like, do people report the events of a novel in order, or are they kind of picking and choosing? And it seems like people do a lot of rearranging. And so I'd be curious to see, like, could we use some of that work as well to identify these larger kind of journeys or odysseys, and identify that, like, okay, yes, this looks like a series of things. You know, like Xenophon in the Anabasis is like going so many parasangs every day, and it's kind of obvious that that's part of a journey, but yeah, how difficult is it? We don't really know.
Yeah, I feel like, yeah, well, in this case, I see your point that basically you do have sort of well-defined, fine-grained level, but maybe contrary to the example with character networks, it seems not immediately clear how to coarse grain. Yes, so what should be the rules of how to define these coarse grained movements? Yeah, well, I have some other, but maybe Jan first, and then like at some point.
Yeah, and absolutely, like we have, there's no intention that we stop here. This is sort of the hardest easy problem, the easiest hard problem. So we're hoping to sort of learn what we can from this experience and go on to these more complicated questions. But that's definitely like where we're going.
Thank you, David and Axel. Great presentation, and very timely as I'm reading Poor Things at the moment, which involves a lot of traveling and a lot of reciting of traveling experiences, which are fictional, slightly by nature, I would say. And also, I haven't finished it yet, but I assume half of the stories are fictional within the fiction, which I think creates a very interesting metaphysics of traveling in narratives. And it also reminds me, I was teaching the course on networks, I think 4 years ago already, where my students were watching the movie Tenet. Have you seen the movie? It was filmed partially in Estonia. So for those who know Tallinn well, they know how what happened there is a fiction, because there is no way characters can move from frame 1 to frame 2 while the background changes so dramatically. So my students watched the movie 7 times to recreate the network of traveling between sites. For the outsider, it looks like, you know, regular city. So the question, I think, related to what Max asked, like, how can we map things if they are not real? And the complementary question, can we use LLMs? And do they know that these things are fictional, actually? Because so far as I understood, you were using LLMs to identify things and classify things, but have you tried using them to explain certain movements, for example? Would they be able to achieve this movement with one mode of transportation, was this mode of transportation available at the time? Maybe there was a crisis, maybe there was a war, or something else. Do LLMs know that? Can they actually help us?
Yeah, to answer the first part of that question about fictionality, I don't have a like statistically backed answer to it yet. But I imagine so. Like I imagine that they can tell the difference between these fictional or hypothetical movements. One of the things that we did in our map project, so we were trying to identify all these maps that occurred in about 90,000 novels. Once we had our final set of 2,600 maps, we used Gemini to assess whether the map was fictional, of a fictional place or of a real place. I think it had an F1 of like 0.96 or so. So at least looking at a map and identifying whether it's fictional or not, Gemini was pretty good at that. I imagine it to be the case that it would probably be pretty good at that with text too, since text is maybe the format it works better with, but not entirely sure.
It's a fascinating question of like the fictionality within fiction. It has a Inception feel as well, like when the stories are false within the stories. I also I find it fascinating that yeah, like I think we were mentioning earlier, like could you draw a map from the text? But yeah, to what extent are authors kind of playing with space and time versus constraining themselves by the reality? I love that. Someday we'll get to Talon and try to do a Bloomsday of Tenet and see how hard that is.
Yeah, it's a good exercise to recreate it actually on the map of Tallinn to see how tricks were used in filming the.
I once had an interesting encounter with Dan Huttenlocher and David Crandall, who, when they wrote their Mapping the World's Photos paper, you had all these gazillions of Flickr pictures, and then if you looked at large cities, most of the map would be empty. And there would be these spikes of like, everybody takes a picture of the Colosseum and nobody's interested. If you go 200 meters any direction, nobody's interested in that location. And one of the questions I immediately had was like, how does this look in time? And so we tried around with this and we found actually some patterns. And with that, I sort of encountered one particular thing as a sort of like trained specialist in the topography of Rome. At some point I watched Fellini's Roma out of like complete other context. And in the end, there is this sort of motorcycle race or cavalcade or whatever they want to call it, of a mob of motorcyclists driving through Rome. And it hit me as somebody who, drove a Vespa myself in Rome, that it actually makes sense. You can actually do that drive. And so I drew that on a map. But one of the most crazy things was that you also found this sort of 1/f attention structure. So there was very few places where there's a lot of time spent, and then sort of you don't jump, but you almost go at hyperspeed between places. And that sparked a question, which since 2010 I'm carrying around with myself and I have no answer. Is that like sort of how the internal map is structured of people? Like do we sort of like, go places and then you're in your theater scenery where sort of the scene happens, and then whatever happens in between has this sort of, is it contiguous, yes or no, question mark. So is there a sort of actual map, or is the map the addendum to something that is a representation that is not map-like? And I think, David, you sort of like are probably familiar with like how in antiquity people sort of like depicted space. Like if you look at the Nile mosaic, for example, which is this depiction of Egypt, which came to us via fragments. And so people had to sort of like rebuild the picture, and based on Greek vases, they actually reassemble it in fragments. So it doesn't make sense. You can't go from one place to the other, but you basically literally take a jump in the air. until some other archaeologists rearranged the picture and now it's more contiguous. But it's still, so there is still this sort of like issue that different people, including archaeologists, have different contiguousnesses between well-known parts of the space. And so in some sense, is that something we can find, A, in the novels, B, in people, and C, maybe also in the large language models, so that space and map and 3D Euclidean sort of particular space is not the primate, but there is sort of some kind of multidimensional thing going on, which may have properties which we don't know. And what you're sort of extracting from these novels is sort of like the bridges between these areas. And then the question is like, how does that space look like? And I'm not sure if I can explain this well, but like sort of like, we almost need a tour through this sort of like spatial representation, which is not spatial in a sense, right? Or not Euclidean, 3D in a sense. I don't know how to put this better, but I think this is a super interesting thing where the thing you mine is not just in correspondence with the map and the 3D space, but it's also, all three of these things are in correspondence with the actual vector representation in a large language model, and maybe also with the multidimensional representation, however this may look like, in our own minds, basically. And isn't that sort of the question? Like, how does that look like? What's the structure of that?
Yeah, I actually, I in college I spent a semester in Rome, and had a very similar experience of like, I understand how these places fit together. Like it's hard to walk up this hill. The fact that Caesar was murdered not in the capital on the Forum, but like outside the boundary in the Theater of Pompey, like you don't really get those things without that physical presence. And yeah, like I think part of this work was about like our authors trying to give the reader that sort of physical perspective on the events that they themselves have, or are they trying to mimic something, or are they trying to edit it in a way that like, yeah, like that section of the road isn't that interesting. It's really the curve that you want to pay attention to. And so they're sort of eliding a lot of that. And does that change over the course of like 1800 to 2020? Like do things become more cinematic? Do they become more edited versus like, Jane Austen, like it takes time to get to Lyme Regis. Like it takes a day in the carriage to get there. That's sort of an important part. Like it's not easy to go one place to another. One thing I've sort of noticed about the recent Star Wars movies as well is that, in the first one, or episode 4 or whatever you want to call it, like it sort of implied that going through hyperspace takes some time. Like you have to sort of get bored and like play the board game with the Wookiee. And in some of the more recent, they sort of jump in their X-Wings and then like they're at the other planet attacking something.
Okay.
And it feels like they've sort of made a decision to elide that kind of distance. So yeah, where do people do that? And I think that's what's really important about that kind of next level of connecting things to the physical space and identifying like where are the authors making choices.
I think we should rotate, so Mike will be next.
Yeah. And actually, just to respond to what was just discussed, the question I sort of ask myself is whether actually authors have a 3D space in their mind when they write. I mean, sometimes we do know there are examples when it is explicitly not true. I mean, in some Ron Grieger novels or in Space Odyssey, it doesn't feel like this has a 3D structure. You have a topology of space that you can think of some things of being adjacent one to another, but it seems that it is not possible to put it, to think of it in terms of space. And I guess in some other cases people just have locations, and they probably don't have in mind, even in the mind of the author, it is not defined how these locations are positioned relative to each other. And it will be very interesting to extract these things somehow. And that is one idea I sort of got while listening to the discussion. And then another one is the importance of time in all this story, and that is my question basically: whether you think you can extract the time and the large-scale structure of space. And because speaking of time, actually, also I think there is interesting question of whether it is. One thing which Jan said that sometimes it is impossible to reach from one place to another in presumed time, but sometimes, and it might be a mistake of the author, or it might be intentional. It might be even sort of wilder things. I think it is well known. It is sort of well known that in Anna Karenina there is this trick when you have two lines of the story, yes, the Lovin's line and Karenina's line, and they go separately for half of the book, and then they meet back again, and in one line it is 1 year past, and another line it is 2 years past. And it cannot be not intentional. I mean, it is, but the idea is that both space and time can possibly be sort of non-linear and non-continuous.
Yeah, I sort of see that as like multiple questions. Like, does the author have a detailed mental representation of space and time? Second, does it matter to the story? Like, do they care? And third, to what extent are they trying to communicate that to the author, to the reader?
Yeah, and sort of fourth is whether it is the same sort of topological structure as the real world, or is it something completely different?
Yeah, like I think of the novel Neuromancer, William Gibson. Like the first half is in these sort of grimy bars, which are fictional, but you can sort of imagine what they would be like. And the second half is in this like completely fictional space station, which doesn't have gravity in different ways. And it feels like the first section is more kind of physically grounded, and the second is maybe more harder to parse. But I don't know if that's coming from the descriptions or just the fact that I don't really know what the space station that he has in mind is.
And one of the interesting parts of this line of questioning from reading and from doing our map project, we found that if we have a map, which is like a very specific grounding of space that the author has in mind, it's not always the case that they are making these maps ahead of time. We sort of assume that they're making the map and then writing the story into that map. But one of my favorite examples is the TikTok of Oz, which I think was the 4th book in the Wizard of Oz series. There were no maps of Oz before TikTok of Oz. The original Wizard of Oz did not have a map in it. And it was actually at the request of Frank L. Baum's publisher. Basically, the publisher is like, dude, your story's really confusing. Let's put a map in there. It'll help people understand what's going on and what you're thinking about. And they commissioned an illustrator to make it, unlike, Tolkien, who's known for drawing his own maps. And so this map sort of happened as a result of the kind of spatial descriptions in the story. And so this sort of like which came first question is really interesting and maybe a way we can start to break down that question a little bit.
Yeah, that's sort of like, I think there's a really interesting thing going on here, that we're operating in a time scale where maps already exist, right? Like if you say English novels, then the great majority of these novels happen at a time where the map convention was sort of well established. And then with book publishing, actually this kind of thing where you actually put a map somewhere, like whenever you give people a tour of any world, sort of like at the frontispiece or at the end or somewhere, you put a map. But historically speaking, sort of drawing an actual map is super hard. I mean, it requires first sort of like, mastering perspective, and then have the notion of a sort of space that is sort of like having a coordinate system and stuff like that. That happens, you get the Formos Roma, you have things in China, but then people forget it again, and then sort of there's all sorts of distortions from which you can learn of like what can go wrong. And I think it's actually quite interesting how some of these maps that sort of like are aligned with text don't look very Euclidean. They don't look, when I say Euclidean, I mean 3D, right? And so there is a sort of interesting thing, if you look at all the other stuff, like in art, this is like super blatant. Like how do they actually denominate that you're in a particular location? You don't do it by sort of have accurate perspective or have if it's a map, be accurate in the depiction, but you have other methods. Like for example, you have attributes, like, you wear a coat that like is used for traveling, for example, like, this sort of red coat with a fibula. If you see that in a painting, then probably the person sort of like comes from somewhere or goes somewhere. You have like sort of like these people laying sideways, which are typically river gods, but they are transcended into sort of like Henry Moore's nude laying in front of every museum, which sort of denominates this is a museum as a river god. So these kind of things, I would be very surprised, and I'm decidedly not a literature person, but I would be very surprised, given what I know about the resonances, that these things don't exist. And then the key question is, what other things which are unspoken, undefined, and unconventional fulfill the same function? For example, in painting, you usually spot, oh, this is a landscape or this is an urban scene by just the background. And you don't even need to see what's going on. You can just blur it and you still see if this is landscape or not. So the timbre sort of gives away, oh, we're in the countryside. And so that is sort of something which I think would all be an armature of what you're doing. Like what you do is super fascinating, but the question is like, what is the surrounding? Like, what is it embedded to? Is the Moby Dick thing really happening on a small ship, or is there a description of how the sea looks different every day? So there's very different ways of how you talk about being on the same 100 square meters on a ship, and so that is sort of, I think, a really interesting thing. And my question for you would be, can you imagine a spectrum of approaches, and what else would you include there, basically?
I also want to go back to where you're saying, like, after the Forma Urbis, maybe between there and the development of nautical maps, like really what you get is these itineraries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where it's sort of it's more like a list of places that you would go on a journey. And yeah, I wonder if that's actually a more literarily useful type of aid for a reader versus a sort of Euclidean two-dimensional map.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a really cool example. There is this thing called the Roman form of a lion, which basically is a picture of a lion with a long tail. Mm-hmm. And then the usual monuments, Colosseum, Pantheon, Mark Aurelius column, Traian column, are actually sort of in the belly area of the lion. And the first time you see this, you just realize this is completely bonkers, it's bullshit, right? And then once you realize that people in Rome walk in at Porta Pia, which is sort of from the north, or not the north, but like, where it's where most maps have.
Is it the Via Flaminia?
Yeah. So you walk in a street which is called Alta Semita, which is a very long road that's super boring. And then you take a turn, and then you take another turn, and then the whole city lies in front of you. So it actually feels like you're walking through this tail of the lion, and then all of a sudden the world opens up for you and you see all the monuments, because you actually end up in the one place, which people usually don't go today because there's a building, where you can actually see all of Rome. There is no hill in front of you, basically. And that thing is literally sort of, I think, a translation of these itineraries, because you actually walk down that street. And, you know, this probably made sense for pilgrims to say this, like, you know, remember, halfway down the tail there was a bar or whatever. Like, everybody will find that bar. Well, nobody could read this map if it was triangulated, because that sort of like means you need to have geometry, basically, right? Which you probably didn't learn in primary school back then. And so that kind of stuff, I think, is a really interesting thing, where we could maybe in these novels see the variety, and if we're very lucky, the onset of these kind of explanations of like, what are the different spatial constructions? So in some sense, it would be cool to get rid of the notion of like, oh, this needs to be equivalent to a two-dimensional map, needs to be equivalent of a three-dimensional map. But for example, asking a question, if you have your itineraries extracted, what is the dimensionality of this map? That is a really big question, because maybe there is tetraders in there which don't make sense in physical space. And that would be interesting, because you know, we can be in one place and in our head we're in another place, and that, like, in literature, this is even easier, isn't it? And so that is sort of something which I would be super curious of, like, how people construct this. And maybe is it like in painting, where you see a bifurcation of these kind of things happening? Like, you know, conventions of depicting spaces are super boring for a very long time. You either get this like portrait or landscape aspect ratio. If you do an actual landscape, it's brown in the foreground, blue in the background, green in the middle. And like, even if people stand in front of the landscape, they paint brown in the foreground, even if there is no brown. And it takes very long to that become realistic. And then within very short time, between 1830 and 1870, all of a sudden everything's possible and you can do whatever you want. And I think that is sort of something which I would be super curious how that looks in literature. Like you know, is there also something going on where I have the feeling like, okay, over the course of the 19th century, we feel increasingly like everybody's on drugs, or is it like super conventional, basically?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting points that you draw up to address the dimensionality question, which I think is really cool. You know, maps are really useful as a tool to be able to look straight down, plot everything in 2D, and simplify the movements. One of the things that we've been surprised by is like the amount of maybe vertical movement that happens. So someone going up in a hot air balloon, someone climbing a ladder, someone going upstairs. And so there is a lot of these, you know, not a lot relative to all the movements, but a surprising number of these movements that are not stuck to the plane of the earth. And I think it's interesting in how we convey that, is like that's a tough question, to figure out. You know, do you have one of those floor plan maps that has the first floor, second floor, third floor all in a row, or do you then make that kind of a 3D sort of model? I think it's a really interesting question.
I'm gonna hand it over to Mike.
Okay. Yeah, I will sort of switch topics now a little bit. I would like to ask a little bit more about the LLM side of things. So basically, why Gemini? Have you tried different things? There's one question. Another question, you said a little bit about what works better, what works worse, but can you elaborate a little bit more on what sort of mistakes it makes, and do you have any idea what practices are good and what bad and why, and etc.
Yeah, I can take this. We've been using Gemini a lot mostly because it has a free tier and it's really easy to do long context stuff with it. That being
It was one of
said,
the first that had like million token
yeah.
contexts available.
Yeah, that being said, we're going to try everything on a bunch of different models for both task one and for task two. So we're starting to assess things with task one. We've used Gemini for a little bit of initial testing. We have several local models. We're going to try kind of all the different sizes of the really new Qwen 3 models. We're gonna try some older stuff, such as like T5, or even like Roberta, just to see how well it does at a task like this. Is this something that you need a really new, fancy VRAM heavy model for, or is this something you can do with an older, simpler, maybe easier to run locally type of model? We're also going to try some of the other flagship models. We're going to try ChatGPT. We're going to try Claude. So we've been using Gemini for our initial testing, but once we get to that phase of like trying everything to compare, we're going to cast a very wide net. Um, and your kind of question on like sort of what has worked and what hasn't, there's kind of just been a lot of trial and error with what we're doing. Sometimes the issue is a technical issue, like how do we fit all of this into a context window that the model can actually keep track of? Other times it's a question of like, does this improve the F1 score or not? And we're getting to the phase where we can do that a little bit more thoroughly. Right now we're working Gemini and then some of the Qwen models. To figure out like what kind of prompt is the best prompt to use. Is there like maybe there's one prompt that works best for Gemini if Gemini's all we're worried about. But maybe there is a prompt that works like pretty well for Gemini and also works pretty well for the others and is a better basis of comparison. So we're at a little bit of a trial and error phase at the moment as we start to work out the scale. The reason we're finally at that point is because we have most of our ground truth annotations finished. All we could do were little kind of one-off, explorations here and there up till now because we could get a sense of things, but we didn't have a firm, like, here's a ground truth to compare to, and we now are at that point.
And in terms of your task one and task two, is there any difference in performances? What is better, what is worse, and if there is a difference, and what sort of typical, do you have any idea of typical mistakes which are happening?
Yeah, I was using Gemini to this was when I was deciding whether to break out the task into two parts or not. So I was only evaluating on task one, which is pulling the strings out of the excerpt. So that was what the evaluation was, but I tried prompting Gemini, just do this, just worry about identifying the strings. I believe the F1 score it got at the time was like 0.78 or so. And then the other way I prompted it is, here's the entire code book. I want you to pull out the string and annotate it with all of these features and return all of them. And then I evaluated it just on how well it pulled out those strings. And it was like 0.68 for the F1 score when doing the entire task at once compared to just task one. So that was part of how we broke it out. The other part of that, though, is I was working with my annotators, and none of us particularly liked doing the entire task at once. It's like it requires a lot of focus and concentration, and we had a lot of words to read to get all of our annotations. So when I broke it out into two parts, and I'm like, just worry about part one, and then later we'll do part two. Annotations came in a lot faster. There was more agreement, and also my annotators were just generally happier with me and more pleasant to be around.
And between annotators, the score is how high? How
Yeah.
compares to comparison between to an annotator.
Yeah, I don't have the agreement scores handy on me for the excerpts that we've done, but we used with the British Legion to kind of train everyone. So everyone was trained on the exact same like first excerpt. And we didn't include that. Like we're not going to be including that as part of our general training data. And for with the British Legion, the F1 scores ranged from like 0.63 to 0.84, assuming that my annotations were the ground truth. So there was a bit of a range, but the way that we do our annotations now, I actually, you've unlocked the bonus slides. So the way that we do the annotation process now, we have a novel excerpt. We have 3 annotators. They go through and each look for all of the movements, and they highlight them. And then at the end of the week, we all meet together. So all 3 annotators who are doing the same excerpt. And I have this tool that Claude vibe coded for me. It's an HTML page. You load in their annotations, you load in the original text, and it'll show like 3 different shades of blue based on overlapping highlights. So we can easily see all the places where like all 3 agreed, or the places where just one of them found something that the other 2 missed. And then they go through all the highlighted text and they come to a consensus. So they highlight each new one, and then that is our ground truth. So we can calculate the annotator agreement. I don't have that handy for this part at the moment, but it's maybe not as informative. It is a useful thing to report, but what we found and we're maybe surprised by is there are many cases where just one person highlighted something and the other 2 missed it, but then it ends up getting included in that kind of consensus ground truth. Part of that is the task requires a lot of focus and sometimes people miss stuff. The other thing is there are quite a few like kind of gray areas in terms of movement that like just require some debate. And so we have our annotators be generally more inclusive than exclusive with that first set of solo annotation. If there's something that they want to discuss with the group, they should highlight it so that the group will discuss it, as opposed to not highlighting and possibly missing something. So hopefully that starts to answer the question.
Thank you.
Cool.
Is there, like, on a more fundamental level, is there a sort of like, when you cannot say, here is a location, there is a location with a geo-coordinate, we go from one place to the other, or here is a room and there's another room with some index, I go from here to there. Is there some other, because this is requiring this projection to the map, right? Like if we just don't do that projection, but say, okay, so basically I've just list of references. So there is sort of something I can identify as a location. There's something other that is not this location. And then sort of like there is a movement from one thing to the other. So in some sense, would it be easier to sort of get a structured excerpt of this sort of like, of the movement instruction, so to speak? So you don't draw the map, but you have a sort of like, if this was a network, you don't do the layout part. You just write the edge list in a sense. So is that sort of something that is more achievable? And then the question is, where do you still get fuzziness? Like, there's probably fuzziness in the nodes, meaning the 2 locations. There's probably fuzziness in like whatever the transaction is from one place to the other. And the question is like, could you measure that? Like, what's the distribution of fuzziness in this sort of thing? Like, is there like how clear are certain things, basically?
Yeah, I think we can measure that. One of the things that we found out early on as we looked for examples of these movements, as we formulated how we were going to do all of this, most movements do not have both a destination and origin. It's great when they do because then we can ground that to a map really easily. And that's something that I would like to do later. A future project I have in mind is taking all of the movements where we know where they go from and where they go to and try to plot it out on a map automatically. I think that'd be really cool. Most of the movements have one or the other. They have a destination or they have an origin. Um, One example is you have someone who is in the kitchen and then it just says she left. That's kind of the shortest possible movement that we could identify is just those two words, she left. We know that she's in the kitchen. We don't know where she's going, but we do know that she had to move in order to get out of the kitchen. And so one of the things that we'll be able to do once we have run this on more novels, is we'll be able to say, okay, here's the ratio of movements that have both a destination and origin to movements that have just one or the other, which I think is something that will be really interesting to see. I'm also curious to see if, lack of a destination is roughly equal to lack of an origin, or if one of those is skewed. Maybe it is the case that authors really, they like to write about people leaving a place ambiguously as opposed to coming to a place ambiguously. And I think that's something that would be very interesting as well.
Which brings me very organically to the other probably natural question you probably have been asked by many people is like, it's not just moving from A to B, but how about whole itineraries or trajectories? And, one of the wildest thing I've done is tracking people from their birth to their death location. There's a very particular reason why we don't include all the stations in their biographies. It's because the probability to have either the birth or the death location, or a birth and a death location, is wildly different. You get a second location in 15% of the cases, and because again this is 1RF, you get in 15% of the cases, or 15% of the cases, you get 3 locations, and so on. And so this decays very quickly. So getting very long biographies / very long trajectories in the age before smartphones and Danish bureaucracy is very, very hard to get. And then the question is, though, is that the same in novels? Because, if you think about the literature of these medieval itineraries, this, seamlessly goes to travel notebooks and stuff like that, which, by definition are actual itineraries from location to location. And so the question is, are novels there realistic or are they not? So do they unrealistically sort of show us trajectories which in real life you would never get because all you see is people being either appearing or leaving, if you're sitting on a bus, for example, right? So is that something you can tackle, you think, or trajectories more than one hop?
Yeah, it is something to tackle. So with the future project I mentioned, the thing I would love to be able to do is to map all of these out. In order to do that, we need to be able to track kind of sequential hops of at least the protagonist, if not side characters. Our movements are tracking any character, so ostensibly after the fact we could track any particular character's movement. That being said, prior work suggests that movements are pretty much all the protagonist. Mm-hmm. But I think it would be especially cool. You mentioned kind of the births and deaths. It would be cool to be able to say, okay, sure, maybe we're interested in how the protagonist moves, throughout the story sequentially. But maybe we're interested in movement until death or side characters. But the goal is to, gather all of this data so that hopefully we can do that. I won't know until we've processed some more novels whether that's actually possible to disambiguate, but part of the motivation for doing this is the hope that we can kind of connect these sequentially. It connects a little earlier to some of our discussion about time. I think, connecting the sequence of movements to the progression of narrative time in the novel would be maybe a way of going about this, as well as kind of figuring out, how long did they travel? So it's lined up with some of the questions we're thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you to go back to your slide where you have these, the curve with broad questions versus circa 2010 distant reading? Yes. Mm-hmm. So you both told us like you'd like to push that boundary, which I found a really interesting sort of like rhetorical sort of like statement regarding this curve, because this looks a lot like a Pareto curve, right? Like not the Pareto distribution, but a Pareto front, where actually the point of the front is that you cannot go beyond, right? Isn't it? And so there is sort of an interesting thing, because this close reading versus distant reading on the x-axis is typically part of sort of Pareto distribution, where you have easy, hard on one direction, and basically how much effort it is to do so. And so this is like sort of something that would be an additional axis. So you could imagine there's a Pareto surface if what you show indeed is a Pareto curve. And why do I say this? Because it's sort of like close reading is supposedly really easy, right? You can do this in a bachelor thesis. And then if you sort of want to go distant read, if you want to read, if you don't have a computer, you want to read a 100,000 novel, you probably need 100,000 people to help you. Otherwise, you will never get done. So you need many, many people. And then sort of like, you can imagine this sort of movement along this front, that you can sort of like move along the front, but it is efficient to be at the front. It's not efficient to be sort of like inside the curve. And so this is sort of like, as like putting up my sort of qualitative hat here. If I was a pure qualitative person, I would be insulted by the close reading dot here being inside your Pareto front, because actually I'm not quite sure if that is so inefficient. Like, isn't close reading also still something that is sort of necessary? And in other ways, is that what you draw here really a Pareto front, or is it sort of like a cartoon, and we need to sort of like actually ask a question if it is really that way, right? Like what does it actually mean to address broad and specific questions, and is there indeed a sort of efficiency trade-off between specificity and general, or isn't the hermeneutic circle demanding that you do both at the same time because one doesn't work with the other? So in other ways, do we need a new picture here and not a Pareto front? Sorry.
Yeah, we're definitely like we're playing with the type of diagram that people often see, and I take the suggestion like we are not dumping on close reading. I think that's an incredibly difficult and valuable skill that we really don't have a lot to add to. I think I think there are technological approaches in philology, especially, where you can sort of marshal a lot of resources to looking deeply at one passage. I would think of this diagram as more about like what is even possible. So, the like you were saying, that the corpus size question, like reading 10,000 novels was physically impossible like 30, 50 years ago. At this point, like, I think the computational questions that we can answer narrowly about a small number of documents, like take out the human reading, but just the computational reading, like that bottom left corner is sort of the Moby Dick is about whales conclusion. Like nobody's particularly interested in that, but it's fairly easy to tell. Going out in the corpus size, like maybe you can find 300 out of 70,000 novels that are about whales. But again, it's sort of like word counting that any undergrad can do with, a laptop, if you have the documents. And it's really like in pushing out the things that we're capable of, it's how much can we do complicated, sort of subtle annotation that might take like understanding a paragraph or a chapter and holding context, like who is the main character, and having some flexibility about language that you couldn't necessarily do just with the lexical approach. So I think that's really where we're going versus like, is there normatively a place where you ought to be? I think that the top right corner is sort of the place that's technologically interesting and might be more humanistically interesting than certainly the bottom right. I've been living in that bottom right corner for a long time, and people definitely have some problems with it.
Let me do one follow-up here. So there is, sorry, we got this camera issue here. There is a sort of, in some sense, you could say, there is complicated questions, which in some sense is what you're hinting to, but isn't it sort of like most interesting to ask really stupid questions a lot of times, which you basically do, and then you get some kind of structure, which is sort of like not just complicated, but you have a sort of like new quality emerging out of this quantity, which is sort of like obviously a tenet of complexity science. And so that is one of the key questions, is like, in how much is this complex? And that is where I think there is a sort of like much more sophisticated question seeping in, which is countering the old divide between qualitative and quantitative. Like, because indeed we don't just count, it's not about frequencies, but all of a sudden it's about, you know, sort of like, what's the structure of that? Can we do a kind of physics of this imagination, basically? And that is sort of something which, where you probably need the stupid questions that are repeated 100,000 times, because otherwise anybody could come and say, it was like, yeah, you ask a lot of complicated things and you get a complicated thing out, but whatever you say is like sort of arbitrary and different every time. But this sort of like transition, I think, is sort of something which is sort of really crucial. And it's not, as far as, you know, I should probably engage more in the digital humanities discussion than I do, but I have the feeling this is sort of something coming more from computer science and coming more from sort of complexity science, like computational social science and so on. This notion that we sort of ask these complexity questions and not just complicated questions at scale. And so in order to sort of like make it a field, in some sense, some integration, I think, is necessary, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And I think thinking about the motivation is important here. Like, Axel, I don't know if you've had the same experience, but I don't get the sense that anyone in the literary side is particularly working a lot on physical character movement. It's not like a big part of literary studies at the moment.
No, I mean, I was just putting together my exam reading list with Lindsay, she's a literary scholar at Cornell on my committee, and works on character movements was not really a thing that we found that much of. So yeah, go ahead.
But what we're kind of hoping for is the like, yeah, I guess I never thought of that. Maybe that's where you're thinking about the sort of systems thinking, but like, I love it when the computation can sort of give you a new perspective on something that was familiar. And you know, I like this work because it's a completely new lens to look at literature and identify things that you wouldn't necessarily have thought were similar, but kind of have the same position on a particular axis. There's another example where you know, Ted Underwood was trying to quantify some literary theories about how much time elapses on like a page. And there's a theory that like sort of early 20th century with film, it sort of drops dramatically and things become more kind of cinematic versus more narrative. And what he did by like analyzing 100, 200 novel passages was that is totally true and it happened 100 years earlier. And so he was able to take something that was literally interesting, like people had, I would put that in the sort of broad generalizations, like from a small number of number of here are my favorite novels off the shelf, and make that much more specific and fine-grained, and like creating this sort of log plot over the course of the 19th century, and like by the beginning of the 20th century it's already happened. It's very cinematic. And so another student and I, Greg Yanni, we tried to, rather than just the pure annotation side, we tried to train some, at that point, just logistic regression models, and expanded that to sort of the 10 to 20,000 novel range, and got, we were able to shrink the error bars a whole lot, but we got basically the exact same curve that Ted had gotten. But I think that's an example of something that was sort of more inspired by a literary theory that we were able to put into, like, get that more sort of no particular data point is particularly important, like physicsy. I'm literally waving my hands here. This is very idea of a different way to collect evidence for something. But again, in the 19th century, the German philologists, like, they collected a lot of evidence for a lot of things. And I think it's more kind of mid to late 20th century that sort of the idea that literary studies would not be based on a lot of examples kind of became more common.
Actually, it comes exactly to the question I wanted to ask. What I'm sort of somewhat worried about concerning this picture, on the one hand side, on the other hand side, what is my understanding why sort of the bottom left cross is important and sort of interesting, is that actually we do not care equally about different novels or different pieces of. So I mean, if there are 300 novels about whales, it is sort of, for many reasons, natural to care about Moby Dick than about any other single one of them. And that is to say that what is exactly is the subject of literary studies? Is it all existing novels, or is it only sort of relevant novels? Should they be reweighted in some way so that more culturally important, more, I don't know, more those which were read by more people sort of weight heavier? And is there anything known about, for example, some literary characteristics of the texts which distinguish more culturally important ones from less culturally important ones? That's sort of the question and sort of invitation to discuss this.
Yeah, I love the question, and I think for this work we're kind of taking the epistemological approach that we want to get the broad picture of literature writ large. But yeah, would you just be able to sort of reweight things? I think there's always this sort of bestseller code type analysis, like, is there a difference between things that have kind of lasting value? And I don't think it's likely we would discover that, like, the best, most important novels kind of have more twitchy physicality to them. But I do feel like when something's kind of groundbreaking, it's often sort of unfamiliar. And as things become more familiar and more formulaic, maybe the author has less work to do in terms of setting up why something is happening or what it's doing. Like, when you watch your 17th Old West movie, do they need to explain that the gunfight happens on Main Street or something? Or does it just sort of go there? Axel, do you have any thoughts about that?
Actually, by the
Yeah.
way, in this particular example you gave about the speed of the time elapsing per page, is there any discernible difference between sort of sample of 100 famous novels and the much larger one? Or is it just exactly the same?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And the famous versus not distinction isn't one I had maybe been thinking about before this conversation, but one of the things that I had thought would be interesting is like, what if we take the novels that, you know, are sort of famous for having lots of movement in them? Lord of the Rings immediately comes to mind, Ulysses immediately comes to mind. Like, what if we take some of these and we set them aside and, you know, compare that to the rest of our novels? The other thing I maybe think would be interesting is, you know, taking a almost like the chronotope approach and saying, okay, we've now found the movements in 100,000 novels. Is there a certain type of novel? Like, let's not worry about the title of the novel. Is there a certain type of novel that is a long journey by boat novel? Is there a maid moving around in the household type of novel? Is there a youth worldwide adventure novel? Like, are there certain of these types that appear just based on kind of the qualities and types of those movements that appear in them? And I think that would be a really interesting thing to kind of find out.
So this is sort of like a really interesting thing, where because movement is time and space, right? So there is so one natural extension is to extend the question of Ted Underwood, not only to say how much time elapses on the page, but also how much space is covered in the same page. And that also sort of like gives you sort of a notion of movement where you can forget about your sort of maybe A and B point to point kind of thing, but like it becomes this sort of like how much do you cover of the extension of space, and sort of in some sense you could even dump this down to like, are we small right now, mid-size, or are we large? Like what's the zoom level? And that gives you two axes which are almost as primordial in a sense, like Peter Dodds did this power danger Kurt Vonnegut thing of like how your story is in the power danger sort of coordinate system, and it seems like that this lends itself to be something like that, where you sort of like ask yourself, okay, where is my novel in size versus time? Like how much time does elapse, and in how much space are we actually acting? And then, because it's novels, they actually have a reading time. You could probably even draw sort of like a context window, move through this thing, and that you can basically, even without sort of like having any idea about named entity recognition and toponyms and whatever, you could still sort of like get an idea of like what genre your novel is, and they will probably cluster into sort of like neat things, like in Star Wars, where you have this sort of like inside outside space, right, where inside is sort of the more politics sociological thing, outside is sort of like the kind of social thing, and then space is sort of like everybody kills each other. And so there's this sort of like thing where there's probably a lot to gain by dumbing down this whole issue to this thing you have extracted. Like you came up with this small, large thing, right? And Ted with this extension thing, which may be easier than like your axis you defined in the very beginning, which is this sort of between physically grounded and dreamlike. Because all of a sudden you have to ask yourself a question like, what does it even mean to be dreamlike? Because I can totally dream of a labyrinth, which is very spatial. So if like my dream, for whatever reason, it's just like being a rat activating my place cells, that's very physical, but it's totally very dreamlike. And so can we get to that? And probably from the simple thing where you have your small, mid, large, short, medium, long duration thing going on by how you act in the space, you probably get an answer to your definition of like what is dreamlike, because in dreams you can jump, in real space you cannot. And so sort of, yeah, this is a super exciting project. Like, sort of like you got me excited. Yeah.
That's our goal.
Yeah, it's gotten like I like the response that people got. It's sort of like, oh yeah, I wouldn't have thought of that, but that is really interesting. Which, often with this sort of work, you describe it as like, well, obviously it's this, and maybe it's that, and maybe it's not, but people don't really see the question there. One thing we haven't talked about so much, everything we've done is in English, and I think it'd be really interesting to look not just across the sort of time axis, but like, do novels in French have more movement or less movement?
And by the way, have you done originally English texts or English translated texts?
We've mostly done original English. We have definitely looked at some stuff in translation. I can't remember off the top of my head. I feel like we had an excerpt from the Odyssey, that was in there.
So the initial question is whether there is a difference.
I think there's an interesting thing going back to the maps, right? Like it would be cool to look at stories that were written in different places where map conventions were more or less developed, like, right? So the like, just look at Indian maps, which, they don't follow sort of like orthogonal systems, but they're very useful because they're relational. So would the Indian texts that are associated with the same region/culture be also relational, or would they sort of like, would they be different? And a simple example there is, I think, and there is also obviously a sort of weird feedback loop, which is the classic question of like, what's the date of the of Homer, right? Which is that sort of like governing how vase depictions look like, or were there lots of vase depictions, and at some point the story was canonized later, and then where the vases become canonized. Is that the moment when sort of like our current version of Homer is sort of like, there was a redaction or something like that. And so all of a sudden you try to answer something with pictures, like you would answer it with maps, but then the key question is like, oh, wait, what is actually the direction of development here? And I think that is a sort of like really crazy sort of like notion, but it's sort of tractable because in your particular case, you got this like cool thing that there is these maps emerging at some point. And by the way, this is sort of something which we haven't talked about. These maps are super conventional, right? Like they're absolutely conventional. There's so much going into them, like, the little box, and then like, what is described how and whatever. So this is way after Renaissance, where people 50 times sort of invent a reference letter, and then Euler solves his Königsberg Bridge problem, where this was more fluid. But this happens at a time in the 19th century where there's very clear conventions of how you draw a map. Like you don't use certain lines for something and you use certain lines for something else. They have very, very clear meanings, partially due to the fact that the tools and the colors were sort of like precious, and you would do it a certain way. And I think that is sort of like something that's interesting, because it seems to me that the maps are more conventional than actually the text, because the way maps are done is sort of a hard-won thing in the 19th century. It's not like today where everybody can do a map, right? So, yeah.
I think I would actually push back against that just a little bit. Maps necessarily have certain conventions, otherwise they wouldn't be maps anymore. One of the really interesting things that I found with the map project, one of the things I want to be able to do later is to, figure out the qualities of these maps. For example, do fictional maps have more detail in them than real maps? Like, are there more roads or geographic features? I want to quantitatively figure that out. Anecdotally, the fictional maps tended to be better maps, as far as maps coming from novels. The fictional maps tended to have a scale bar and a legend and a compass and everything labeled. Whereas like maps of real places often, I have a map of I believe it was Lake Michigan that I only know is Lake Michigan because there's nothing else on Earth shaped quite like Lake Michigan. It has no labels. It has maybe lines that indicate state boundaries. I have some other ones that are they would almost categorically fit into something like an illustration, where one character is like, oh, you need to go to the end of the street, turn left at the mailbox, and then walk through the woods. And then on the next page, there will be like a line going across the page and like maybe a cluster of trees and an X for the mailbox. And it's very sparse and lacks any of the like legend or compass details, which is really interesting.
That's exactly what I mean. So the compass and the legend and the scale and stuff like these are conventions, right? So people
Yeah.
agree that this is the way it has done. And if you look historically over centuries, the way maps are like that are constructed is in a relational manner. So you would actually like the classic thing is like the word clouds of Stanley Milgram, where he asked people in Paris, name your 10 favorite places, and you draw them all on top of each other, and then you get the map of Paris with these words like Eiffel very large and sort of like Sorbonne a little bit smaller and my supermarket super tiny, right? Because only I go there and stuff like that. So that is a relational map, which then only becomes sort of like conventional orthographic or topographic the moment you define these symbols and sort of like put them on a rectangular grid. While if you draw a line and they say, oh, this line is 50 feet, like this wall is 50 feet long, that's a relational thing because I probably draw a shitty line by hand because I cannot even put it on the map because I measure all these sort of walls. And once I've measured all of them, I can triangulate and actually sort of create a conventional map. And so this is sort of surreal. So I'm not surprised that the fictional imaginary maps are more graphically accurate, as you would say, while the others, they're more rooted in sort of like, as you said, like they're more physically grounded. So the weird thing is shitty looking maps are often more physically grounded because they have actually measurements on them, for example, and non-rectangular corners and stuff like that. While once they look clean, they actually sort of like, there's a lot of convention coming in and this is how the way it's done and stuff like that. So there's this weird sort of thing, like the better the picture looks, the probably the shittier it is in actually giving you a real idea about what reality looks like. And like there's,
Or the lived experience of being in that place.
Sorry?
The lived experience of being in a place, like, okay, you approach from this angle and then suddenly everything opens up.
Even there's things like where, some of the inventors of central or like developers of central perspective, when they documented an actual place where you would stand somewhere and you look at the perspective, you would see a ruin and there would be a ruin behind it that would be occluded if you would sort of do it properly with a proper central perspective. But, if you just draw the ruin a little bit higher, nobody sees that. Like in front, in reality, you can't see the ruin behind it, but in the drawing you can do it. So the drawing is wrong from graphical accuracy, but it's correct because it shows you more information. And so these kind of things are sort of something which we know people play with that in graphical depiction. And I would be very surprised if they wouldn't play with it in literature, in description too. Because there is obviously sort of, basically, if you would say physically grounded in a conventional way, literature would have to come like the list of triangulated points by Leonardo da Vinci to sort of like do the circumference of Rome by triangulation. That's the most boring novel you can imagine, right? While if you sort of like bend, sort of like, you have an irregular pacing of how you walk along the top of the city wall and explain what you can see, and sometimes you explain a lot and sometimes less, is way more organic and probably more like a lived experience. So physically grounded, I think, is a really prickly concept that you should sort of like, try to unfold, maybe do the inverse, like look at the literature and see how is this physical grounding actually done, and how it can be put into question, this primacy of 3D Euclidean geometry, which obviously seems to not be it, basically.
Yeah, versus sort of emotional geometry or attention geometry.
So
Like
we had
you mentioned Rome, like that. There's this great example of like the Flickr photos taken by people visiting New York tend to sort of cluster around Midtown, and the photos by people who live in New York City are like everywhere except Midtown.
yes. We have done actually this for Rome, so this is not a published paper yet, but like we've done this in sort of more detail than people who did the same thing 15 years ago. And now we even like we have enough resolution to sort of look at the temporal trajectories even on a daily level. And one of the interesting things is in Rome in particular is there's these places where both hang out. And still, as you enter the place, it's like you can use the same bar and behave like a local or behave like a tourist. You will experience a different bar. They have even different prices and stuff like that. So this kind of
You never sit down.
yeah, exactly. Never sit down first, right? And so this kind of thing of like sort of you have sort of like this contingency of how you walk into a situation and how you walk out of a situation that determines how where you actually are, where sort of the location is not a point, but the location is sort of like a combination of your geographic
connectivity.
location and your topological embedding into the socio-cultural whatever space, basically. I think that's a very, very interesting thing. So we hit the 2-hour mark, which is great. This is awesome. Thank you very much. This was a really good
And you
time.
guys have to go write some grant proposals, I hear.
Yes. Should we announce what's next or keep people surprised?
We are not sure what is next.
Exactly. So we will keep you posted. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for
Thank
inviting
you.
us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.